All right, let's dive into one of the most absolutely chaotic periods in all of Roman history. Being a Roman emperor in the 3rd century, it was probably the most dangerous job in the world. It didn't matter if your reign was virtuous or vicious, it almost always ended the same way, with a sword in your back. So picture this. A Roman emperor is murdered. The throne is empty. Who gets to pick the next one? In the 3rd century, the answer to that simple question could literally determine the survival of the entire empire. Now, during the utter chaos of what we call the crisis of the 3rd century, the answer was, well, almost always the same. The army. The legions, the guys with the swords, they were the ultimate kingmakers, plain and simple. But in 275 AD, something happens. After the very skilled but very severe Emperor Aurelian gets assassinated by his own officers, the army does something completely unthinkable. Something that has baffled historians for centuries. They actually send a letter to the Senate back in Rome, and its contents are just astonishing. It basically said, hey, brave and fortunate armies here, we want you, the Senate, to appoint a successor, someone your judgment declares worthy of the imperial purple. The imperial purple, that was the color of the emperor. The army was voluntarily just giving up its power to choose the next ruler. The army's refusal to act created a situation nobody was prepared for. For the first time in living memory, power wasn't being seized by force. It was being handed off, almost like a hot potato. And this led to a shocking power vacuum, leaving Rome completely without a ruler. For 8 entire months, the most powerful empire in the world had no leader. No emperor, no usurper, not even a rebellion. It was this bizarre, polite standoff where the legions and the senators just kept insisting that the other side should be the one to choose. The great historian Edward Gibbon, the authority on this, he called this whole situation one of the best attested but most improbable events in the history of mankind. And he was right. For 8 months, the empire just existed in this weird state of tranquil anarchy. Eventually, with the empire totally rudderless, the senators blinked first. They finally accepted the burden the army had given them. And this led to the Senate's brief and, as we'll see, ultimately doomed return to relevance. So, who did they choose? A guy named Tacitus, one of their own. He's 75 years old, he's wealthy, respected, and supposedly a descendant of the great historian of the same name. He was the Senate's ideal candidate, a wise philosopher king, not another power-hungry general. On paper, perfect. But Tacitus himself was not convinced at all. When the Senate acclaimed him, he basically stood up and protested, asking, "Are these limbs, conscript fathers, fitted to sustain the weight of armor or to practice the exercises of the camp?" He knew he was an old scholar, not a soldier. He knew what the job really required. And yeah, his fears were completely justified. This whole experiment lasted just over 6 months. He died, totally broken by the hardships of a military campaign out in the East. The Senate's high-minded ideal of a philosopher king just shattered against the brutal reality of what the empire truly needed, a warrior. So, with the Senate's wise old man dead, the empire swings in the complete opposite direction. Power goes right back to the army. But this creates its own fascinating problem, the soldier's paradox. What happens when the perfect warrior is actually too good at his job? This whole situation sets up the ultimate contrast. On one side, you have the Senate's guy, Tacitus, trying to rule with wisdom. On the other, you have the army's new man, Probus, a hardened general who's all about ruling with pure strength. So, which one is going to save Rome? And Probus, he seemed like the perfect answer. He was a brilliant general. He secured the frontiers, he crushed invaders and usurpers, he restored discipline to the legions, and, really importantly, he showed immense respect for the Senate. He was the total package. He was so successful, in fact, that he started to develop a fatal ambition. Gibbon tells us he had this vain hope that he could soon, get this, abolish the need for a standing army. In other words, he wanted to create a world so peaceful it wouldn't need soldiers anymore. And for that beautiful vision of peace, his own army murdered him. Can you believe it? While he had them doing public works, literally draining a swamp near his hometown, they mutinied and killed him. The perfect soldier was executed by his own soldiers for trying to make their job obsolete. So if the wise man isn't safe and the perfect soldier emperor isn't safe, then who is? The murder of Probus proved that the system itself was completely broken. This wasn't just another crisis. This was a total collapse, and the speed of the collapse was just dizzying. After Probus is murdered in 282, his successor, Carus, dies mysteriously just a year later. Then you get Carus's two sons. Numerian is murdered in 284, and his brother Carinus is killed in 285. That's 4 emperors in 3 years, a total bloodbath. And what about those last two, the sons of Carus? Man, they perfectly represent the rot. The older brother, Carinus, ruled from Rome and was a totally corrupt and cruel tyrant. The younger one, Numerian, was a gentle, poetic soul out with the army in the east. Neither one was fit for the job. And sure enough, Numerian is murdered in secret by his own father-in-law, the Praetorian prefect Aper, who is hoping to grab power for himself. So now the army in the east is completely leaderless. Their emperor is dead in his tent, and his murder is being hidden by a treacherous commander who wants the throne. The entire fate of the empire is just hanging in the balance. This stage was set for a new master to arrive. I mean, seriously? With the empire in total chaos, its leaders either dead or just depraved, who could possibly restore order? Who could finally put an end to this bloody emperor lottery? Well, the answer came from the commander of the imperial bodyguards, a man named Diocletian. He calls an assembly of the entire army. He stands up there in front of everybody, points right at the Praetorian prefect, Aper, and declares for all to hear, this man is the murderer of Numerian. And before Aper could even get a word out, before he could defend himself, Diocletian draws his sword and kills him right there on the spot. No election, no debate from the Senate, just a single brutal sword thrust in front of the cheering legions. And with that one act, a new era for Rome began. The crisis was over. Diocletian's blade had ended the chaos, and he would go on to completely remake the empire. But it leaves us with this haunting question. Rome finally had order, which it desperately needed. But was the price of all that stability the last traces of its freedom?
Today, we're diving into the incredible story of a Roman emperor who stepped in when the empire was on the absolute brink of collapse. He saved it, sure, but with a plan that was so revolutionary, so controversial, and then he did something no one saw coming. He just walked away. So yeah, let's get into it.
I mean, just think about that question for a second. That was the reality for Rome in the late 3rd century. The empire was just too big, it was too broken, and it was getting hammered from every direction. It was a problem that needed a solution nobody had ever thought of before. To really appreciate what Diocletian pulled off, you have to understand how bad things had gotten. They literally call this period the crisis of the 3rd century. And trust me, it was pure, unrelenting chaos. You had barbarian tribes pouring over the frontiers, and at the same time, ambitious generals popping up all over the place, trying to carve out their own piece of the empire. If you were the emperor, you'd race off to deal with a disaster in Germany, only to hear that 2 more had just erupted in Syria and Egypt. It was a totally impossible job.
And into this mess steps our guy. And he is not who you'd expect. He wasn't from some fancy, noble Roman family. Nope. Diocletian's origins were, as one historian so bluntly put it, abject and obscure. His parents were actually slaves. He climbed the ranks of the military on pure skill and grit alone. This is a man who, by every traditional Roman standard, had absolutely no business being emperor.
And that's really the key to understanding him. Diocletian wasn't the typical Roman hero emperor, the charismatic warrior out looking for glory on the battlefield. His skills were described as useful rather than splendid. He had the sharp, calculating mind. He was a master of policy, an organizer. You could say he wasn't the action hero Rome thought it wanted. He was the brilliant systems administrator it desperately, desperately needed.
So what's his big, world-changing idea? Diocletian looked at the crumbling empire and saw the root problem wasn't the barbarians or the rebels, not really. The problem was scale. He was just too big. So his solution had to be just as big, and it was completely radical. He decided to split the job.
He called his new system the Tetrarchy. It literally means rule of four, and this wasn't just some temporary fix. He set it up to be the new law of the land, a whole new constitution. The idea was to have a ruler on every major front, ready to act. And maybe most importantly, it was designed to create a clear, peaceful line of succession.
Okay, so here's how the org chart worked. You have Diocletian, the top dog, the senior emperor, or Augustus. He takes the wealthy, strategic East and aligns himself with Jupiter, the king of the gods. Then he elevates his old army buddy, Maximian, to be his co-Augustus in the West. Maximian gets to be Hercules, the muscle to Diocletian's brain. Then they each adopt a junior emperor, a Caesar, to handle the toughest frontiers, like the Danube and Gaul. It was a dream team, designed to save the empire.
And you know what? It worked, almost immediately. With an emperor stationed near every single trouble spot, the Tetrarchy started putting out fires with incredible speed. For the first time in decades, Rome could actually fight on multiple fronts at once.
And the wins just started stacking up. A huge peasant uprising in Gaul? Crushed. Britain, which had actually broken off and formed its own little empire for a decade? Yeah, that was brought back into the fold. And in the East, after one early stumble, the Romans scored this massive, decisive victory over their arch-nemesis, the Persian Empire. It was just one success after another. The system was working.
And you can just feel the swagger coming back to the Romans in this quote. When the Persian ambassador shows up to beg for a peace treaty, the Caesar, Galerius, just lays into him. He brings up how the Persians had captured and humiliated a previous Roman emperor, Valerian, decades earlier. The message was crystal clear. Rome is not weak anymore. Don't mess with us.
So problem solved, right? The empire is stable, the enemies are defeated. Well, this is where the story gets complicated. Because this new age of peace and order came with a very, very steep price. To make his system stick, Diocletian had to change Rome itself, and in the process, he basically threw centuries of Roman tradition out the window.
First on the chopping block, the Roman Senate. By moving the imperial capitals out of Rome and closer to the action on the frontiers, Diocletian made the Senate totally irrelevant. He didn't attack them or abolish them, he just ignored them. He left them there in Rome to become, as the historian Gibbon so perfectly put it, a venerable but useless monument of antiquity.
Next, he changed what it even meant to be emperor. For centuries, emperors kept up this fiction that they were just the first citizen, a leader among equals. Diocletian? He dropped that act completely. He started calling himself Dominus, which means lord and master. It's the word a slave would use for their owner. The message was unmistakable. The emperor was now an absolute, godlike ruler.
And to really hammer this point home, he brought in all the fancy ceremonies of the Persian court. He started wearing a diadem, a headband covered in pearls, which for centuries was the ultimate symbol of a king, something Romans absolutely hated. And anyone who came before him, no matter how important, now had to lie face down on the floor. It was a total transformation of imperial power.
And the bottom line of all this change was that the new, stable Roman Empire came with a huge bill and a mountain of paperwork. Instead of one imperial court, you now had four, each one magnificent and expensive. The government bureaucracy exploded in size. And of course, someone had to pay for all of it, which meant a massive hike in taxes for everyone. Diocletian didn't just save Rome, he created a whole new kind of empire, one that was a lot more authoritarian and a lot more expensive.
So, after 20 years of ruling, after completely rebuilding the state from the ground up, Diocletian, this master of policy, decided his job was done. And he did something that no emperor in Roman history had ever done willingly before.
After a really bad illness, the 59-year-old emperor decided, that's it, I'm done. So on May 1st, 305 AD, in a grand ceremony, he took off the purple robes of an emperor and just retired. He actually forced his co-emperor, Maximian, who loved power, to do the exact same thing on the same day. This was the final, ultimate test of his system, to prove that power could be handed over peacefully by design, not just through murder and war.
Diocletian went home and retired to a massive palace he'd built for himself. A few years later, when the empire predictably fell back into civil war, his old partner Maximian came begging him to come back and fix things. And Diocletian gave this just legendary reply. He basically said, if you could just see the cabbages I'm growing here with my own hands, you would never again ask me to trade this happiness for the burden of power.
And that's really the legacy of Diocletian, isn't it? The son of a slave who made himself a god. The brilliant manager who divided power in order to hold it all together. And the one man in Roman history who was powerful enough to just give it all up. He saved Rome from total collapse, no doubt about it. But in its place, he built an autocratic state. And so, that leaves us with the big question. Was it worth the price?
So how does a system that's built for perfect stability just completely collapse into chaos? Well, we're about to find out. We're going to see how the Roman Empire's brilliant plan for sharing power totally backfired, kicking off almost 2 decades of brutal civil war and clearing the way for one legendary figure to seize absolute control. Okay, so let's set the scene. Our story kicks off at the end of the 3rd century. The Roman Empire had been rocked by 50 years of near-constant civil war. So, to stop the bleeding, the Emperor Diocletian came up with a pretty radical new system, the tetrarchy. The idea was to divide power between 4 rulers, 2 head honchos, the Augusti, and their 2 junior partners, the Caesars. It was basically a machine engineered for stability and, most importantly, smooth transitions of power. But, as the great historian Edward Gibbon famously pointed out, the whole system had a fatal flaw. It works great, but only as long as its creator was there to run it. So when Diocletian did the unthinkable and actually retired in 305 AD, the whole thing started to shake. Why? Well, because the system forgot to account for one unstoppable force: good old-fashioned human ambition. That smooth transition Diocletian dreamed of? Yeah, that never happened. Instead, the empire got plunged into 18 years of just absolute mayhem. We're talking 18 years of confusion, backstabbing, and no less than 5 separate, brutal civil wars. The dream of a stable, orderly empire was officially dead. So how did a system designed for peace become a catalyst for war? Well, that raw ambition we were talking about, it found its first real opening in the clashing personalities of the 2 men who were now at the top of the food chain. The 2 new senior emperors, the Augusti, were complete opposites. Over in the west, you had Constantius. He was moderate, well-liked, kind of the good cop of the empire. But in the east, you had Galerius. He was a tough, arrogant general who Gibbon perfectly said was impatient of an equal. He just didn't want to share. And that fundamental clash of personalities, that was the first major crack in the whole foundation. Galerius wasn't interested in an equal partnership. He saw his chance to grab power. So he totally ignores the 2 most obvious candidates for the junior emperor spots, the sons of former emperors, Constantine and Maxentius. Instead, he appoints his own loyalists, Maximin and Severus, as the new Caesars. In his mind, he just pulled off a brilliant coup. He believed he now controlled 3/4 of the entire Roman world. He thought he'd won the game before it even really got started. But Galerius's careful little plan was about to get blown sky high by a couple of rebellions he absolutely did not see coming. His neat 4-man system was about to turn into a chaotic free-for-all. The first domino fell way out in Britain. When the popular emperor Constantius suddenly died, his legions didn't bother waiting for instructions from Galerius back in the east. Nope, they took matters into their own hands and, right then and there, hailed his charismatic son, Constantine, as the new emperor. It sent a pretty clear message. Our loyalty is to a man, to a bloodline, not to some system. And almost at the exact same time, a second fire started, this time right in the heart of the empire, in Rome itself. The people and their elite soldiers, the Praetorian Guard, were furious about new taxes being imposed by Galerius, so they revolted and declared their own emperor, Maxentius, that other imperial son who'd been snubbed. And just like that, the empire had two new and very illegal emperors. And this is the result. It's just sheer, wonderful chaos. I mean, take a look. Within a couple of years, the tidy four-ruler system had devolved into a six-way royal rumble, with all these different guys claiming to be emperor. You had the legit guys, you had the usurpers, you even had Maxentius' dad, the old Emperor Maximian, coming out of retirement to get in on the action. The tetrarchy hadn't just failed, it had completely imploded. Eventually, the deaths of the older generation, guys like Maximian and Galerius, kind of thinned the herd a little bit, and the massive, sprawling conflict started to focus in on the two big, ambitious young players in the West, Constantine, up in Gaul, and Maxentius, down in Italy. And you couldn't imagine two more different rivals. While Constantine was busy governing Gaul, earning this great reputation as a protector and an effective leader, Maxentius was just rotting in Rome. He became this cruel, awful tyrant, totally bleeding the city dry to fund his own lavish lifestyle. So eventually, the tyrant in Rome provokes a war, and Constantine responds with one of the most audacious gambles in history. He marches his army over the Alps, straight into Italy, knowing he is massively, massively outnumbered. He's got about 40,000 tough-as-nails veterans. Maxentius, he commands something like 170,000 troops, but a lot of them were soft, inexperienced forces who'd gotten used to the easy life in the capital. So this just sets up one of history's greatest questions, right? Could a small, disciplined, elite force led by a brilliant general actually beat an army that was 4 times its size? Constantine's invasion of Italy wasn't just an invasion. It was a masterclass in speed, violence, and just sheer will. He moved with a speed that was just breathtaking. He crosses the Alps, smashes one of Maxentius's armies at Turin, then he marches to Verona and completely destroys a second, even bigger one. In just 58 days, he's conquered all of northern Italy and is now standing right at the gates of Rome itself. The final showdown came on October 28th, 312 AD. Maxentius, who'd been hiding out in Rome, was finally shamed by his own people into marching out to fight. He chose to meet Constantine at the Milvian Bridge, but he made a huge, fatal tactical mistake. He lined up his massive army with the deep Tiber River right at their backs. He left them absolutely no room to retreat, and the result was pretty much inevitable. Constantine's veteran cavalry just shattered the enemy lines. The Praetorian Guard, to their credit, fought to the death, but the rest of Maxentius's army broke and ran, straight into the river trap he had laid for them. In the panic, the tyrant himself was shoved off the bridge, and as Gibbon puts it so vividly, he was immediately drowned by the weight of his armor. The victory at the Milvian Bridge was absolute. It made Constantine the undisputed master of the entire Western Roman Empire. But his quest for ultimate power still wasn't over. There was one rival left on the board. So, the empire was still split in two. Constantine makes a temporary alliance with the emperor of the East, a guy named Licinius. He even marries his sister to him to seal the deal, but everybody knew this wasn't going to last. It was just a pause. After a short first war, they settled into an 8-year truce, with both of them just building up their armies for the final, inevitable showdown. In 324 AD, that final war finally came. And you know what? We see a really familiar pattern here. You look at the numbers, and Licinius has the bigger army. But the real difference was quality. Licinius might have had more men, sure, but Constantine had better soldiers. His troops were the battle-hardened veterans of Europe, and they were fanatically loyal to the general who had led them to victory after victory for 17 years. At the Battle of Christopolis, Constantine's veterans delivered one last decisive, crushing blow. Licinius surrendered and was soon executed. And just like that, it was over. After 18 years of chaos, after 5 civil wars, the shattered Roman world was whole again. united under the will of one man. And you've got to understand, this victory wasn't just the end of a war, it was a total revolution. The empire was put back together after almost 40 years of being divided. This led directly to the founding of a brand new capital, a new Rome, called Constantinople. And, maybe most importantly of all, it paved the way for the rise of Christianity, a decision that would completely redirect the entire course of Western civilization. Which leaves us with one final huge question. By tearing down Diocletian's system and reuniting the empire by brute force, did Constantine actually save a dying Rome? Or was his incredible, history-changing triumph just the last magnificent blaze of glory before an inevitable and final collapse?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling a massive question, one of the most profound transformations in all of human history. And we're exploring a brilliant and frankly controversial answer to how it all went down, all drawn from a single masterpiece of historical writing.
I mean, this is a question that completely reshaped Western civilization. How on earth does a faith that started in obscurity, facing constant persecution, eventually triumph over the most powerful empire the world had ever seen?
Well, back in the 18th century, the historian Edward Gibbon came along with a radical idea in his legendary work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He just set aside all the divine explanations. Instead, he took on what he called the historian's melancholy duty to find the purely human reasons, the mixture of error and corruption that allowed this new religion to succeed.
So, how did he do it? How did Gibbon actually build this case? Let's break down his iconic argument.
Gibbon's whole point was that Christianity's success wasn't because of one single thing. He argued it was the result of 5 powerful forces, all working together. We're going to explore each one of them, from their intense zeal and the promise of an afterlife, all the way to the organization of the church itself.
So, these 5 points right here, they are the backbone of his revolutionary explanation for how Christianity achieved its remarkable victory over the ancient world. Let's start with the first one. Okay, so Gibbon's first cause. It's a little counterintuitive. He basically argues that a key ingredient for Christianity's success was its absolute, uncompromising intolerance.
And this is where Gibbon makes a really fascinating distinction. He says that Christians got their inflexible zeal from Judaism, but, and this is the key part, they totally transformed it. They took the idea of one true God and turned it from something defensive, meant to protect one nation, into a full-on offensive, universal mission to convert everybody.
And this quote right here, it just nails the mindset. See, a Roman philosopher might look at a pagan god like Jupiter and say, that's just a quaint story. But for an early Christian, no way. Jupiter wasn't a myth. He was a very real, very powerful demon. That meant every pagan festival wasn't just a party. It was an act of demonic worship. You can't compromise with that, right? That absolute zeal becomes the only logical response. So you've got this intense zeal, right? Well, Gibbon says it got supercharged by his second cause, a concept that gave Christians this incredible psychological edge, the promise of a future life.
Just think about the difference for a second. For the greatest Roman thinkers, the idea of an immortal soul was, well, it was vague, kind of doubtful, an idle opinion as Gibbon puts it. But Christianity, it comes along and presents the afterlife as an absolute, undeniable certainty. And the stakes couldn't be higher. We're not talking about some shadowy underworld here. We're talking about a vivid eternity of either total joy or just horrifying torture. All of a sudden, this isn't just philosophy anymore. It's a powerful reason to act right now in this life.
And this fiery quote from the church father Tertullian, wow, it shows you just how potent this belief really was. I mean, imagine you're part of a community that's being persecuted. The promise that one day you'll see justice served, that all your suffering will be rewarded, that's an incredibly powerful motivator. It's what gets people to convert and even to become martyrs. All right, so Gibbon's next 2 causes really worked together as a team. One was, supernatural, and the other was social. But both of them helped to strengthen the faith on the inside while building the church's reputation on the outside. So first you have this claim of miraculous powers.
And Gibbon is pretty shrewd here. He says it doesn't even matter if the miracles were real or not. The point was that the constant belief in them made God feel incredibly close, like he was intervening all the time. And then you pair that with the fourth cause, their really strict, austere morals. This discipline gave them this powerful reputation for being virtuous, which really stood out in Roman society at the time.
And Gibbon argues this strict morality came from two places. First, there was this deep personal sense of repentance for your past sins. But the second part was social. Think about it. They were a small community. Everyone was watching them. So every single member's actions reflected on the entire group. That kind of social pressure, he says, helped create what looked to outsiders like a society of exceptionally good people.
Okay, Gibbon's final cause. This one might be the most important of all. It's not about what they believed, it's about how they were organized.
This is where we get to the heart of Gibbon's political analysis. The Christian church wasn't just a new faith. It was, in his words, a Christian republic, a superorganized, disciplined, and resilient state, growing right in the heart of the Roman Empire.
And you can see exactly how this republic grew over time. It started out as just scattered independent groups in different cities, but pretty soon the office of the bishop emerges to lead each one. Then those bishops start meeting up in councils or synods to get on the same page. And before you know it, within a couple of centuries, they've built what Gibbon calls this great federative republic that stretched across the entire empire.
And this new republic? It had real power. It had teeth. The power of excommunication was just massive. We're not just talking about spiritual damnation here. The church was also a huge social safety net. It took care of the poor, the widows, the orphans. So to be excommunicated, to be cast out, that meant you were cut off from everything. Your friends, your community, your only support system. It was a huge deal.
So why are we still talking about this? Why does Gibbon's analysis still feel so relevant, more than 200 years later?
It's because Gibbon did something much bigger than just explain the rise of Christianity. He gave us a totally new way to understand history itself. He showed how a massive, world-changing event could be explained not by some grand divine plan, but by really tangible human things, psychology, sociology, and just brilliant political organization. He basically handed us a toolkit for looking at how any idea, any faith, any movement can grow and eventually take over.
And that leaves us with one last thought. Inflexible zeal, a promise of a better world, claims of special insight, a strict moral code, and a really disciplined internal structure. I mean, look around you. You might just find that Gibbon's 5 causes are still very much at work today.